c'est pas dans le lien de Juter Kélim. Juter Kélim, ça va dans un isou qui lui doit rien. C'est quoi c'est quoi
So let's get right into it. The previous shiur, on Thursday, we started getting into the intricacies of the sugya of Shiur Gris, which to a great extent can be said to represent the whole tchum, the whole subject of shiurim in general. And beyond just tracing particular specific shittas, that so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that, but we paid attention to the nature of how the halacha, you could say, the observance of the halacha and how we measure the gris developed. We saw how it begins with the lashonos of Chazal, where it sounds like everything is simple and obvious and straightforward. We know exactly what we're talking about. We saw there are some short general statements from Rishonim, and then how suddenly the discussion bursts out into the open, gets very complex, very quickly, deep in the middle of the era of the Achronim, a while after the Shulchan Aruch and the Neis HaKelim, and how suddenly this becomes an area of measurements and calculations, and in this manner till today. So I want to summarize what we covered last time. That'll be a portion at the beginning of the shiur right now. So we said there's a Mishnah Nida, which we assumed is the Chachamim's own hamtzah. Their halachas are their own idea, the ksamim, the tliya, and that's the shiur they came up with. They said it looked like a gris. Versus Nagayim, we have the Mishnah Gufa Shel Baharas, Ke Gris HaKilki Meruba, Mekoim HaGris, Teisha Adashas, Mekoim Adasha, Arba Sayras, Nimtzu Shleisha Meshesh Sara. So we have this cheshbon of the 9 lentils, 3 by 3, 36 hairs. And over there, it seems clear that the main shiur, the primary shiur, is the Sayras. That's an actual measurement of skin where the tzaras would be found. But Chachamim found it easier to say, you just want one number or one size, take the gris. He said, of course, the poil is a bean, kilki is Cilician beans, which was another variety near Eretz Yisrael, and a gris means that you take the bean, which grows naturally, sort of fold it over, and you just crack it open, and you have a flat half. So despite the seeming differences between the Mishnah Nidin and the Garim, we saw that the Rambam sort of combined the two in Isurei Bia. The Rambam wrote the Gabik Samim V'Hanimtza Ala Begarin Matama Achiyah Kagris HaKilki Shehu Meruba Sheyesh Bekadei Teisha Adashas Shalosh Al Shalosh. So the Rambam brought the Adashas, the lentils, into the picture. From there to turn Shulchan Aruch. Along the way, we have the addition of the Ramban, who said you can just use whatever the biggest bean you find, whatever that is. You can just use that. From Ramban, it sounds like some of the Rishonim were still using beans. From the Ashkenazim, quoted in the Beis Yosef, sounds like maybe they're starting to focus more on the secondary cheshbonos of lentils and hair. We also mentioned the Yereim. The Yereim said, we don't know what the Gris Shel Poil is, and we have the question of, isn't this all too large? Aren't lice much smaller? Therefore, we should sort of use our Shikol Hadas and just use our intuition as to what we think a louse, what stain it would have actually left behind. Although the Yereim is mostly not the Shita we follow. We saw that the discussion began in the Shalos Teshuvos Dvar Shmuel, which was printed in 1702, so that's when the discussion begins, where he was corresponding with others, and they really started getting into this pilpul and shaklavataria about what's the gris, and what are the adashim, and what are the cyrus, all these different makayos, and that's where the confusion begins. Afterwards, we saw the Tshuvas of the Chacham Tzvi, and a Tshuva from 2 years later, from Taf Samach Daled. He was asked if he had anything, the Kabbalah, any traditions about the Gris. Chacham Tzvi said no, but his main message, his takeaway was, calm down, don't get too worked up over it, don't treat it like an Isser Karis. It's all Medivrei Seifrim. You can rely on whatever the Rishonim say calmly. He brought the Yesod that Chachamim must have known that there is no bean larger than the stain of the Ma'achelas. Chachamim knew that. We can rely on them. And we should not assume that maybe Chachamim are talking about a smaller gris. Why? Because they said Gris shel ksamim hu lahakel. The shiur is a shiur lahakel. And there's no reason to say that this gris should be smaller than the gris of Nagayim. And as to the questions about what are these adashim and what are the sizes, right? Because in Kalim it says that adasha, the shiur adasha, throughout Chazal, is like doilev, like tana, ela beininus, zu mitzvahs. So now, how are we supposed to figure out what a beininus and a mitzvahs is? And he mentions that he actually saw, in his time in Turkey, he saw lentils imported from Egypt, and he thought they were larger than the regular lentils. The Alter Rebbe quotes that from there. On the other hand, we have a description of the adasha hamitzvahs, a mention of it in Maasros. That's not chayv in Maasros. It's a description of the Rambam based on Tosefta and Yerushalmi, which is a bit unclear. The Rambam seems to be describing something pointy, and it's out in the desert. It's a wild variety. So if that's what the Mishnah is always talking about, then do we have any idea what that is? So that could cause a lot of confusion. But the Chacham Tzvi sort of cut through all of that and said that based on the Rambam in Isurei Bia, the Rambam was very, kept it very short, kept it very curt. He just said, Adashim, Adashas. So the Rambam presumably relied on us to understand that it's supposed to be a Beinani, medium size, but otherwise you don't have to figure out mitzrius, not mitzrius. Any person can go and take not what he considers to be 9 average lentils, and that should be fine. Let's just ignore all the confusion. And then we saw what seems to be a shtickle chedesh, that he said if you actually want to just return to the original shiur of Gris shel Poil, so that's what we call in German the Große Bunnen, big beans, the ones that taka split in half. It works out very nicely. Lanias daiti, that's what you should be mashar halacha l'maisa, and don't ask how is there a louse that big. It all goes back to the same point. Hey mamru b'hei mamru, they knew, just rely on them. His son Rabbi of Emden also supported his father's shiur, his father's opinion that you can take the standard bean. We noted that it doesn't seem like they ever tried, it ever occurred to them to try to measure the bean versus the lentils to see how those compare. Then we got a bit into what the experts, or maybe the quote-unquote experts today on ancient matters have to say. Right? So generally, they say that the kina is the louse. It's not a different species, and the beans are what we call fava beans today. And in fact, there are a number of Rishonim who actually say that explicitly. And based on the identification of the louse and the bean, the question as to the discrepancy in the size would stand. And even though there is one expert, Felix, who argued, looked it up a little bit, I didn't see that he gets into that much detail, but his general statement was, based on descriptions in Chazal, it seems fair to say that the gris is smaller than the fava bean. So they must have been referring at that time, the standard gris, the standard poil, must have been a smaller species, a smaller variety of bean, and it was maybe about 1 centimeter instead of 2 centimeters. So dafka, of course, the large standard size of 2 centimeters, dafka is the one that fits with the most common shita of the me'ilt staka. That summarizes that. Then we got to the most central and important and influential makar for generations till today on many issues. That, of course, is the shut me'ilt staka of Rabbi Yoina. Let's get his name right this time. His name is Rabbi Yoina Landsefer, which meant that he or his father was the sefer for that medina, for that region, so they called him Landsefer. And we said he passed away at age 34, left a big mark with having lived such a short life. He passed away in the year 1712, and then in 1757, a bit of a while later, they printed his shuvas, and that's where this shuva first appeared. And there are many yesodis here that influenced the halacha, and perhaps you could say all shiurei Torah in general, right? So he was asked about the woman who left a mark on a piece of furniture, a kesem, and the question was, how we talking you to get an exact shiur here. So first, the Me'il Tzedakah lays out the problems. Says you can't rely on the pictures in print. I still haven't figured out what exactly he means, but I suspect he might just mean that it's referring to Mefarshim and Nagaim. If you look up Mishnayos where there are descriptions of shapes like this, often you'll find a tzir in the Mishnayos or in the Mefarshim. So I imagine that might be what he was referring to, not in Sifrei Hilchas Nida. So the way he makes it sound, he actually reproduces his own version of the picture he thinks is worthless. So basically it seems like they were drawing a square with 3 by 3 circles inside, but you can draw that in any size you want. That doesn't actually, it gives you a sense of what a 3 by 3 circles in a square looks like, but it doesn't actually tell you what the shear is. So that's not helpful. If you look in the Darkei Moshe here, it seems to be talking about, if you look at the Cyrus, what's the shear of Lamed Vav Cyrus? You look in the Darkei Moshe, it seems to be talking about hair on the head. That, of course, would be a very, very tiny area. And just to add right now, to help illustrate that, right, his square, ultimately, we said was 18 millimeters by 18 millimeters. And that's supposed to be the equivalent of 9 Adashim, 3 by 3, which is supposed to be the 36 iris, which would be 6 by 6, right? 36 is 6 by 6, and each Adasha would be the equivalent of a small square of 2 by 2 hairs. If you look it up today, just search how many hairs are there on the average person's head per square centimeter. The answer is between 124 and 200. I think 200 is maybe Caucasians and maybe other people it's less. So that's in 1 square centimeter, that's 200 hairs. So imagine at that rate what 36 hairs would be, what the shear of 36 hairs would be very, very, very small. But in Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah changed tracks, and the Ramah wrote, "Kameshen kvuos begufei shel adam." Okay, that's easier to deal with. Now we're in business, but the Me'il Tzedakah says it's still too difficult to calculate hairs on the body. Where on the body are you going to calculate? And there's the problem. If you turn to the Adashim, there's the problem of identifying the Adashim that were mentioned in Chazal, as we've already covered. So this summarizes the confusion that they were in at this time. And by contrast to the Chacham Tzvi, he doesn't even seem to think about looking into beans. So, complete contrast. Doesn't mention the possibility at all. So what are the Yesodis in the Me'il Tzedakah? So we're going to summarize the major points that he made. I count about 7. Point number one is, we can prove that Nagayim, and Nagayim, it's certainly talking about Seir HaGuf and not Seir HaRosh. And Alter Rebbe summarizes this in short in Sivkot Yud Aleph and Sheres Yehuda. Even after the Chazara, the one thing that Alter Rebbe still commended the Me'il Tzedakah for was for his proof that it's clearly referring to Seir HaGuf. Point number 2 is that the halachas of Nida should be the same as the halachas of Nagayim, right? That's what the Rishonim were doing with the Gris Shel Poel. So clearly, that carries over to the Cyrus. The Cyrus are the Cyrus HaGuf by Nagayim, so it's the Cyrus HaGuf for Nida as well. So now when I want to measure for Nida, I can use the Cyrus HaGuf as a point of reference. And to the question as to why the Mishnayos have different Lashonos, and maybe Nida was meant to be a smaller shear than Nagayim, so he says, same kind of argument that we saw in the Chacham Tzvi, that the Shiurim of Ksam are supposed to be Lahakal. And surely they held that a Gris Shel Poel mentioned in Nida is the same size as the Gris mentioned in Nagayim. So why does it say Gris Shel Poel? Not to tell you that it's a different size, but to tell you that the shape doesn't have to be the same. In Nagayim it has to be Gris HaKilki Meruba. That was important to emphasize in Nagayim. They're telling you in Nida Gris Shel Poel, that means it could be elongated, doesn't matter. But otherwise we should assume that they are the same. And that's something Chacham Tzvi said as well. So that's very important. Point number 3. In his view, it's too complicated to pursue the hairs, so let's focus on the lentils. Point number 4, when it comes to what size lentils should we work with? So we should just use the common lentils that we find. What about the Mishnah in Kolel that says mitzriyas? And what about the Rambam in Maisus that says that the dashas mitzriyas have this peculiar shape and they are a desert variety? And that sounds like it's a totally different variety that we're not familiar with. So then what are we going to be left with? So he says, no, let's just assume that there's something wrong with the translation of the Rambam. We know Pirsha Mishnayos is a translation from Arabic, so we can always blame any problems on that. So it surely was talking about our variety all along, and there must have been a desert variety of it, or it grew in the desert. Interestingly, unlike Chacham Tzvi, who said that the Egyptian ones in his day were larger than the European ones, he says he was told that the Egyptian ones are the same size as the European ones. So if you want to somehow use today's lentils in Mitzrayim as a point of reference, that's what he says. Although he does say that it's the same size as the large ones in Europe. So it's the ages Brura, we can rely on that. Okay, so ultimately the same conclusion of Chacham Tzvi. We can use the lentils that we have. Question number 5, point number 5. Of the lentils that we have, we established that. Should we use the largest ones that we have, or should we use the medium ones? So even though, on the one hand, we have these Mekayos that say, use the biggest Gris, whatever Gris you find, use the biggest one. But presumably, it's only referring to the Gris. Chazal knew that there's no Gris bigger than the stain of a louse. But we can't say the same thing for Adashim. They didn't mention anything about Adashim. And in fact, it says in the Mishnah, Beinainius. The only thing we do know about Adashim is that it's not the biggest. So, who's to say that if we took the biggest ones, maybe we'll end up with a shear that's much larger than the shear Gris. And the Alter Rebbe brings this Maskan in Sefkat Yud Gimel. And this was also essentially Chacham Tzvi's conclusion. Ultimately, he still was a little doubtful as to maybe whether we should consider the largest ones that he has, maybe those are still what the Torah calls, what the Mishnah calls, Beinanim. And we should assume that they had an even larger one. And that fit with the report that the Adashim HaMitzriyos are like our big ones. If the Adashim HaMitzriyos of today are the same ones of then, and the Mishnah calls those Beinainius, so then I could use the big ones in Europe and call them Beinainius. But on the other hand, and we'll say it more accurately this time, he found in Beis Yosef and Yeridea Simen Samach Vav regarding finding blood in an egg. The Beis Yosef writes, Shekesher Chelmoin, so you're finding it in the part that connects between the white and the yellow, the white and the yolk. Shekesher Chelmoin, Hu Kedmus Kesem Ogoil Bereichav Adosha Gedoyla. That's the same size as the stain, the round stain on the width of a large lentil. So what he seems to be taking away from here is that large ones are large ones. A dasha gedoyla is an adasha gedoyla. So we don't want a gedoyla, we want a beinanis. So let's just take our beinanis. He says, "V'gamarti likach ha-beinanis shalanu, v'gam b'zeh hamin atzmai." He said there were 3 varieties, 3 sub-varieties. That was his first question. And once he took the medium variety, the most average of the average. Although ultimately, he did end up measuring both sizes, but the one we care about is the Beinainius. And then comes what may be the biggest yesod in this whole tchum. He asks, when it comes to these shiurim, do we actually have to sit and measure? Do I have to whip out my measuring tape and my tools to say that this is the Beinanis? And that's a specific question. And then generally, Agav, Kol Shiur Chazal. Does it have to be b'medida or could it be b'oimed? Is it being Zerayah from Erevin, from Tchumen, I believe? That the Gemara says essentially you have to measure. You can't just estimate. So you see that Shiur D'Rabbanan need medida. Although, with regards to his question as to whether he should also use medida to decide which are the most average lentils, at that point he decided there is no way to, how are you ever going to, what's your assessment? How are you deciding what's big, what's small? That you have to sort of use your instinct. But for shiurim generally, you have to measure. And that seems to be the basis for what he then went on to do, which seems to be very revolutionary for this entire tchum of shiurim, because he's literally bringing precise measurements and geometry into this sugya. And on the final point, the question that everybody asks, the shear that the result is much larger than a kina. So he says something more interesting than the Chacham Tzvi. He says, Kol midas chachamim keinhu, And then he says, could be that in those times, the shiurim back then were bigger. The lice were bigger. The sheer gris was bigger. Not bigger than the gris now, but that the sheer of the blood that you would find was a larger stain than the stain you would find now. And it was lafi erech, the people then. So there's assumption that they were larger then, and the lice were larger, and the stains were larger. But still, even after things shrank, the shiurim didn't change. Why? Because they set a size, that size stays. Shouldn't the lentils also shrink? He says, no. So he seems to be saying that in his assessment, could be people shrank, could be the kina shrank, so the actual blood is much smaller now than it used to be. But the things that grow are less likely to shrink in his view. So the adashim probably stayed the same. So when we measure the adashim, we're getting the original shear of Chazal. That original shear of Chazal now seems out of touch with the kina today. But yeah, that's because things changed at different rates. And this actually is leads us, or can lead us, into the major discussions in the tchum of shiurim, as to, big part of the discussion is, did things change, what changed, how does that affect shiurim? I'll get back to it once I finish summarizing what he said. Ultimately, the same conclusion as Chacham Tzvi, and then he comes and describes his measurement, his system, his method. So he says, after all of this, so I measured, and so we said there were no inches and millimeters and centimeters back then, apparently, but there were carats. There were in the field of diamonds and precious stones and pearls. There were carats. So he says that he did measure, and the average lentil, the beininus, was kenekev grad echad on the tas bechinas hamargolius, a bit more. And Benish in his Sefer points out that a carat is said to be 6.2 millimeters today. So about that, or slightly less than that, would fit with his final product, which is 3 by 3, 18 by 18, 6 to 18, stems pretty closely.
How does Shraga describe what he says that the small nekev is a carat?
He wrote, Habeninis b'min habeninis, haya kenekev grad echad, b'tas bechinas hamargolius, v'oid loimat. And grad is a carat. And we measured the larger adashim, that's 2 carats. Then he came up with this ingenious idea that he wanted to be able to sort of measure it down to the dots. So what's a dot? So he decided to he writes shumshimim, I understand that to mean poppy seeds. So he measured that the min ha-beinini of adashim, 9 of them is equivalent to 280 poppy seeds, and 9 of the big ones is equivalent to 390 poppy seeds. Interestingly, those numbers aren't perfect squares, so I'm not sure how it fits in exactly. It may not have been the most perfect system. And of course, the Sheiras Yehuda mentions that this is the part where the Alter Rebbe lost the Mi'ot Tzedakah. He couldn't follow the poppy seed cheshbon, and he couldn't follow the carrot cheshbon, so that sort of locked the Alter Rebbe out of most of the calculation here. It says, Cheshbon ha-me'il tzedakah yaga ma'od v'le'olsa b'yadai k'hu meyusir al garinei shumshimin. Doesn't explain what the problem was, but yaga v'le'olsa, because it's meyusir on that, and he tried to obtain a tas shel bechinas margalia shekayden test, and he asked the Seicheri Leipzig, those traveling to the more Germanic cities, if they can get one for him, and they couldn't. And then the Mi'ot Tzedakah says, then he got in touch with experts on geometry, so that they can then reshape this square into other shapes, into other geometrical shapes that have the same area. And he said he was able to test it by using his shumshmim. So every shape they gave him, he then filled it up with the shumshmim, and he says, it fit im tzvufim im revachim. Again, I'm not sure how scientific that part of the test was, but at least he thought it was supposed to be a nice way of keeping track, that it's more or less the same area. And then he goes through the shapes, and I shared a link you can see the pictures of the shapes. So he describes them, right? There's a square, there's a rhombus, there's a triangle with equal sides, there's a triangle with unequal sides, there's a circle, and then there's some kind of kavim, kashtiim, And then he has also another square and another circle based on the larger shear, which we ignore. And as we said, the square is about 18 by 18 millimeters, and the circle has a diameter, a line across of 21 millimeters, which is equivalent to our nickel here in the United States. Many pointed out, of course, you have to have the right copy of the Mildstucke or else it's pointless. And this was how the Mildstucke made history, and certainly for the Gris, it shapes the halacha till today. Before we jump into the next stage of the discussion, just to elaborate a little bit on this point that the Mildstucke made about how does the lice and it doesn't seem to be the same size as the Gris. Right? The Chacham Tzvi just said, let's just rely on the Chacham. The Mildstucke said, no, it could be the kinim and the people got smaller, but the shear didn't get smaller and the adoshim didn't get smaller. So I saw that both Reb Chaim Noah and conversely the Stipler, his nemesis, both invoke this line, this passage in their discussions. The Stipler, the way he sees it, is that if you have a shear and a metzias, right, so you have the shear Gris based on the metzias of a kina. And now the metzias got smaller, the kina got smaller, and not the shear does not get smaller, the original shear of Chazal should still stand. That's what seemingly we see here in the Mildstucke. Chaim Noah argues that's not possible. Can't be. And this is in Shiur Mikveh, page 160. He writes, Muchach beferish, the shear shenosnu Chazal mishum ha-metzias, mishtana kishemishtana ha-metzias. If the reality changes, then the shear based on that should also change. This is an exception. The Mildstucke is specifically talking about this gzeira. Their gzeira was on this shear. So it's dafka gzeira d'Rabbanan. Because they expressed their gzeira with this shear, so now we can't come along and shrink the thing that they said. But if it's all the other shiurim d'Oraisa, if it's based on the metzias, then let's say the mikveh. The mikveh is based on the metzias of a person's size. So if the person's size changes, and now he can't fit into the water that Chazal said should cover a person, so then you can't say, we'll stick to the shear. No, the shear has to adapt to the metzias. That's the context here, and it translates into the shear ha'ama, the shear ha'mikveh. And there are many other points and mahalchim, of course, to everything we're saying here. Also, just to comment for a moment on the lentils themselves. What do the experts have to say about lentils today?
It's different. I thought Chaim says we don't say miskadol base, we don't say.
Okay, it's too complex to get into. But in the case of the mikveh, the context here is mikveh, and he's saying that if the person's size taka changed, so then the mikveh would also have to follow. Regarding lentils, right? So you have this Yerushalmi about the pointiness, which the Rambam, people quoted b'shem the Rambam. So again, Felix, who had the smaller Gris, he also says that the Adashim mentioned in the Yerushalmi must be a smaller variety, which do have some pointiness somewhere in the seeds. And maybe that's in line with them both being smaller. They say if you just want to go, there's one approach in modern combining archaeology with shiurim is, let's say Chazal mentions Zaysim. So maybe you want to dig through Eretz Yisrael and see what Zaysim you find, or maybe if you can get a sense of Amos, if you know that the measurement, the area, the space between two places was a certain number of Amos, if we can find those two places today and measure now, maybe we can see how long the Amos are, etc. So following that system, if you dig, so we can find lentils, you can find remnants of lentils, I guess fossilized lentils. And in fact, if you follow the tenets of archaeology, you could see the development, you can see how the lentils themselves developed over time, depending on which era you find them in. And generally, they divide it into two categories. There are lentils with a small seed, which is about 3 to 6 millimeters, and then there are larger ones, 6 to 9 millimeters. And though the larger ones are considered to be more advanced, as time went on, they were able to develop larger ones. So it could be, if you take all of that and just say the beinus, then the beinus would be around 6, which would fit nicely with the Mildstucke. That's just, but ultimately it doesn't seem like anything is especially and particularly clear cut. So could very well be, after all is said, that maybe the original Gris and the original Adashim were smaller than we're assuming. And even more recently, Reb Chaim Noah, when he was measuring Adashim in his time in Eretz Yisrael, he arrived at a smaller shear. So it was even possible 100 years ago it really depends on the Adashim you have. So now we're moving on. So if you paid attention, you'll notice that we didn't mention the following two words, the word Sela or the word Agudol, right? And the reason for that is because the Miltzdaka never brought it up. And this is first raised by the Plesi, the Kreisio Plesi, in the section called Plesi. So let's take a look at this. It's pretty short, and follow the logic. So in the Plesi, Hilchas Nidasim Kuf Tzadik Sif Katan Yudal, which is later on Sif Chavav, right? This Aska Badam, Sh'i Afsha Sh'i Mimenu Kasam Ela Gris. The blood she was dealing with was the size of a gris. V'nimtza la Kashnei Grisin. Right? So the halacha is that she can say a one gris came from the blood I was touching, a one gris is from the machelas, from the kina. So comes the Palesi and says, we just discussed previously mentioned about the sela, right? Two women are being misasik with a tzipor that's dam kasela. And right, so we end up saying that you could say, and each one ended up with a sela on her, so you could say each one ended up with a chatzi sela from half the bird. But what explains the other chatzi sela? That's too large, that's larger than a gris. That's why they're tmeis. So right, so that step one, we can prove very clearly that chatzi sela is larger than a gris. Okay, what's the size of a chatzi sela? Well, let's start with the size of a sela. What's the size of a sela? A sela is a shlish tafach, a third of a tafach. The Alter Rebbe, when he brings us in Mitzayim to Siman Lamed and Siman Memches, these are in Hilchas Treifus, where it says that if there's a hole in the animal's skull, and the hole is the size of a sela, treifa. What if there are a bunch of small holes? If all the small holes combine together to be a shlish tafach, treifa. So a sela and shlish tafach are understood to be equivalent. There's more of a discussion about this in Siman Memches, but we're not going to make things extra confusing. Let's just assume that in Gemara Kolel and in Hilchos Treifus it says clearly that the width of a sela is shlish tafach. So that means that since we're talking about a chatzi sela here in this halacha, each woman has a chatzi sela, that means the blood on her is a chatzi shlish tafach. And pay attention, he's assuming here that it's a shear of length. So we know the shear of a tafach, of a sela is a shlish tafach, so we're just going to cut that in half and say half of that chatzi sela is chatzi shlish tafach. Okay, what's a chatzi shlish tafach? Now we know, of course, that a tafach is 4 fingers. Simple to remember. Just pick up your hand. So a shlish tafach. What's a shlish tafach? A shlish tafach is divide 4 into 3, 1 1/3. 1 1/3 etzbos. Since we're talking, that's a shlish tafach, a sela. What about a chatzi sela, chatzi shlish tafach? So you have to divide 1 1/3 in half. That means 2/3 of a finger. Now, how much is that? Just to be able to visualize. Let's say Reb Chaim Noah. Reb Chaim's Noah, we see again how adjacent this is to the big machlekasim. According to Reb Chaim Noah, an agudel is 2 centimeters, which is about the gris of the miltzdaka. And there are other numbers as well. So if you're telling me that a chatzi sela is 2/3 of an agudel according to the cheshbon of the Plesi, so what's 2/3 of 20 millimeters, 2 centimeters, 20 millimeters? What's 2/3 of that? That's only 13.3 millimeters. And that's the chatzi sela, the chatzi shlish tafach, the 2/3 of an agudel. That's the larger shear that they're tmeis, and that means the gris has to be smaller than 13 millimeters. So you see how this cheshbon is creating major problems. According to the Chazon Ish, who makes the agudel a bit bigger, 25 millimeters. Okay, so 2/3 of that is 16 millimeters, still smaller than the gris. So how did the chatzi sela end up being much smaller than the gris? He says, Vanida Isi, that Rava Chassid, Hashalim B'mada, Rabbi of Prague, he used geometry with 9 lentils, using Euclid, using Kamus Recha V'Eirech, and Kanti Yufta, because if the shear of chatzi sela is 2/3 of an agudol, so then a gris has to be a chatzi agudol. According to Reb Chaim Noah, that means the gris would be, according to Reb Chaim Noah's agudol, that means the gris would be, according to the Plesi, about 10 millimeters. It's half of the cheshbon we've been going with until now. According to the Chazon Ish, you could say, if you say half an agudal, 12 and a half. That was the Placey's question. So now we get to the Alter Rebbe. The first thing the Alter Rebbe said, and then the Chazara. So if you look in Sivkat and Yud Gimel, the Alter Rebbe says, we know Chatzi from later, Sivchav Hey Sivchav Vav, Chatzi Sela is more than a Gris. We know a Sela is a Shlish Tefach. We know that a Shlish Tefach is a Gudel Shlish. So far, we're on the same page as the Placey. Now the Alter Rebbe starts mixing in the barley. Gudel is 7 Sa'ir Zu Eitzel Zu B'doichak. Kedel Kamon Simen Reish Ayin Beis. That's Hilchas Sefer Torah. And the Shulchan Aruch there got it from the Rambam in Hilchas Sefer Torah. And that's where the Rambam decided to make a big announcement about Shiurim. The Rambam writes there, Roichav HaGudel HaOmer B'chol HaShiurim HaElu V'sha'ar Shiuri Torah Kula V'hu HaBeinani, the average Gudel, K'var Dekdaknu B'Shiuroi, I've looked into it, U'mitzanuhu Roichav Sheva Sa'iris B'noni Zubit Sadzu B'doichak, 7 average barley stuck together, the long way. V'hein Ka'erech Shtei Sa'iris B'ravach, that would be the equivalent if you laid them the other way, that would be the length of 2 next to each other. Chol tefach ha'amor b'chol makim hu arba etzbais mizu, and all the shiurim are built from that. The tefach is 4 fingers of that. The amma is 6 tefachim of that. And again, we're not going to question that. We're just going to accept that for the purposes of this. So the Alter Rebbe says, so if the sela was a square, and you told me the sela is a shlish tefach, and you told me that a shlish tefach is a gudel shlish, and you told me that a gudel is zayin so'eris. So if a gudel is zayin so'eris, what's a gudel shlish? Gudel shlish, a third of 7 is 2.3. So 9.3, 9 and a third, that would be a gudel shlish, that would be the sela. So if it was a square, then that would mean that we should square that number. 9.3 times 9.3, that would bring us, as the Alter Rebbe says in a minute, to 87 and change. So what's the Alter Rebbe trying to do here? Where's the Alter Rebbe heading? He's trying to find the error in the Placey's cheshbon. Up until now he agreed. But when it comes to what's a chatzi shlish sela, right? You said that this is a chatzi shlish sela. That's where he disagrees. The Placey assumed that just take the a gudel and cut it in half. It's a 1 1/3. Cut that in half. 2/3 of an agudel. A gris is even less than that. It's just oirech and reichav. Alter Rebbe says, don't look at a sela that way. Look at a sela as an area, as a shape. And what you want to do is you want to figure out what the area of a sela is, and then cut that area in half. It's not going to be the same cheshbon at all. So he says, again, if the sela, right, we said the sela is a gudel shlish. Gudel shlish we said is 9 so'edes u'shlish. If we turn that into a square, that's 87. But it's not a square. It's a circle. A circle versus a square, you shave off a quarter. We know it's not exact, but that's what we're going with. So as we already know, a square of 9 1/3 is 87 1/9. So if you shave off a quarter of that, the number the Alter Rebbe throws out is 64 1/2. If you do it on a calculator, it's a bit more. And Tzemach Tzedek already comments on it. But the number the Alter Rebbe throws out is, it should be the area of a round sela with a diameter of tes so'edes u'shlish should come out to 64 1/2 square so'edes. Right? Because the assumption is a sela is a round coin. Hilchas Trefis, they only cared about the width of something. So they just threw out the reichav hasela. The reichav hasela was the number they needed. But now we're talking about shata. We're talking about stains. Stains are not just a hole in the animal's skull. It's a stain. It's an area. So if the sela was square, then we would end up with 87 so'edes. But because the sela was always round, so we have to take the diameter. The diameter is, we said, 9 1/3 so'edes. And if you calculate, it comes out to 64, 65. So now take that area. So now we have an area to work with. Take that area and divide it in half. If you divide that area in half, so half of 64 1/2, that's easy, 32 1/4. 32 1/4 is a lot more than a Gris. Why? Because a Gris, according to the Alter Rebbe's math, is only 25 square sa'eres. A Gris is 5 by 5. So a Gris is 25 square sa'eres, and half a sela, half the area of a sela is 32 and a quarter sa'eres. So let's just go through the numbers to translate that into numbers. Right, so according to the Alter Rebbe, we're just going to also accept Alter Rebbe said that it's 25 sa'eres. The Shiur of the Me'il Tzedakah is 25 sa'eres, 5 by 5. We said already that this square is 18 millimeters by 18 millimeters. If 18 millimeters equals 5 sa'eres, that means 18 divided by 5. 1 sa'era, for future reference, is 3.6 millimeters. Now what did we say earlier? We said that the sela, the roich of a sela, is Gudel Shlish, which is Tes Sa'eres Shlish. A Sa'eres is 3.6. What's 9 and a third times 3.6? 33 millimeters. So the sela is pretty big. The diameter of the sela is way bigger certainly than the quarter, which is whatever it is, 24. So sela is a very big coin. Tes Sa'eres Shlish is 33 millimeters. That's the Gudel Shlish. Now, what if you just want to take the Agudel without the Shlish? The Agudel without the Shlish, if Agudel is Shlish, is 9 and a third Sa'eres, which is times 3.6 millimeters, which is 33 millimeters. That means if you take off the Shlish, take off a third of 33, what do you get? You get 25 millimeters. According to this cheshbon, etzba is 25 millimeters. Whose cheshbon for an etzba is that today? AKA the Shiur of the Chazon Ish. So, without even noticing, you might not have noticed, but this whole cheshbon here essentially is synonymous with the mahalach and the understanding of the Chazon Ish, which we'll get back to. And of course, with the etzba goes the tefach. With the tefach goes the amma and all the dominoes until you call it Torah Kula. So, important to note that in passing, that's what this math is based on. Right? Yeah. But that's relevant here as well. So back to the answer of the kasha of the placing. Right? So we said the sela's diameter is a shlish tafach, which we know from Trefus, which we know is a gudel shlish, which we know is 9 sa'eres shlish, which we know is 33 millimeters. That means the area translates into about, of the circle with that diameter, translates into about 64 and a half sa'eres. And then if you have that area to get 32 and a quarter, so what's the formula? Anyone know how to convert area into diameter? So you look it up, it's you divide the area by pi, get the square root, and double that to get the diameter. So if you do the math of 32 and a quarter, the diameter of that would be about 6.5 sa'eres. In other words, if you take a circle and you cut the area in half, the diameter doesn't get cut in half, nowhere close. The diameter gets a bit smaller. Picture a dime next to a quarter. A quarter is about double the area of a dime, but the diameter certainly isn't. It's the difference in diameter is much less. So if you did this math and you see that the diameter of 32 and a quarter, chatzi shlish sela, is 6.5 sa'eres. What's 6.5 sa'eres? We said it's 3.6 each. 6.5 times 3.6 comes out to 23 millimeters for a chatzi sela. And now the Me'il Tzedakah's Gris is 21 millimeters, so everything works out nicely. Right? So just to sum it up one last time, the Alter Rebbe and the place, assuming they agree about the size of sa'eres, they agree that a sela's width is shlish tafach, which is a gudel shlish, which is tes sa'eres shlish, which is 33 millimeters. The place he held, just take 33, cut it in half. That's 16 millimeters. That's already much less than the Gris. Alter Rebbe said, no, you don't cut if you're dealing with circles, you don't cut the diameter in half, you cut the area in half. The diameter doesn't get cut nearly as much. And that will add up to 23 millimeters, and that's more than the Gris, and everything works out beautifully. That is the cheshbon in case you wish to walk through it step by step. Everything's nice, great. So we would follow the Me'il Tzedakah, which is a nice cooling summon, and we would be machmer Keshitas Chazon Ish and all Shiurei Torah, and everything would be nice and dandy. Comes along the Alter Rebbe's brother, the Sheres Yehuda, Rabbi Leib, also known as the Maharil, the first Maharil in Chabad. Can't get into him too much, but we know that he was like his brother's right hand, both in Niglan and Chassidus. In Chassidus, we know he was the official maniach on behalf of the Alter Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek preferred his anachas when he printed Torah Likutei Torah. In halacha also, it's very clear that they literally, it seems like they worked together, like almost like partners to a certain extent. In the most recent issue of Heichal HaBesht, printed for Tishrei this year, there's an article by Rabbi Nachum Greenwald on the Dmusoi v'Kaimasei HaHalachtis of the Sheiras Yehuda. He quotes from the Beis Rabbi that Hu haya ben meshek beisei shel Rabbeinu v'roi v'nyonei Rabbeinu hayu nechtachem al piv. Everything went through the Sheiras Yehuda. And since we know generally, it's mentioned in the Akdama of the Alter Rebbe's children to Shulchan Aruch, that as time went on, we know generally the Alter Rebbe changed his mind about a lot of psakim, and he became a little bit more independent, following his own conclusions of the Rishonim. What documentation do we have to that? It's all from the Maharil, who in fact was also tasked with being Magia the Shulchan Aruch, and in a number of places, but not all, for whatever reason, he actually notes when the Alter Rebbe's Shita changed, like Reish Kolel mentioned, we saw in Simkuf Pegimel. And in a number of places in his own writings, he details what he knows about his brother's change of opinion. So in that article, he collects 5, and the main one, the biggest one, is this. And in addition, there's another likut there of 35 other shmuas that the Sheiras Yehuda quotes B'Shem Alter Rebbe. So you see the degree of closeness. And we'll see why this is important, because there's a bit of a controversy. Let's take a look at the Sheiras Yehuda. So he starts off by saying, we have the Alter Rebbe's Enfer on the Kreis Uplesi, Leit his cheshbon, not he doesn't say the millimeters, but as we said, Leit the Alter Rebbe's cheshbon, the diameter of a chatzi sela is 23 millimeters, and then the Gris diameter could be 21. Shemati b'kadshe shechazar boy. Why? Because this was all based on the Rambam's lashon, the pshat lashon Rambam, that a thumb is taka 7 sa'eres. All is nice and dandy if you accept all these assumptions as fact. This equals this, and this equals this, and your whole cheshbon works. But ein chacham kabbalah nesayin, madad ba'atzmai. The Alter Rebbe spent a long time measuring many fingers of many people, many sizes, and his conclusion was, the reality is, the metzius is, it's only 6 iris. Right? So that comes out to about 21 millimeters, slightly more than Reb Chaim Noah's shiur. However, Reb Chaim Noah got it down to 20. So what's Pshat of the Rambam? The 7 must not be lying flat, they must be lying sideways, which is equivalent to 6 lying flat. So whoa, just like that, the Alter Rebbe just shrank the whole Torah, down by 1/7. So Ebazai, we say back to the Sela. The Sela is a shlish tefach. The tefach is 4 fingers. Shlish tefach is gudul shlish. It's no longer 9 1/3. Now it's 8. 6 plus 1/3 plus 2. How many millimeters is that? 8 times 3.6 is 28.8 millimeters. Now, we're not dealing with a square here, we're dealing with a circle. Right? If it was a square, so 8 times 8 is 64, but it's not a square, it's a cell as a circle. So shave off 1/3, shave off 1/4, what do you get? Memches. So the diameter of 8 sa'eris translates to a shetach of memches sa'eris in a circle. Half that space, half that area, half of 48 is 24. According to the formula we mentioned earlier, what's the diameter? He doesn't spell it out, but what's the diameter for 24 sa'eris? Would be about 5.5 sa'eris. What's 5.5 times 3.6 millimeters? About 19 millimeters. Oh! Now it means the chatzi sela is smaller than the 21 millimeters of the miltstaka. Once you shrink everything by a sa'era, boom, the whole teretz falls apart. B'nishar kushya sakresio plesi b'takfa. And that means that the miltstaka, if the sakresio plesi's kasha remains, that means the miltstaka shita does not remain. So now all we're left with is how to measure a chatzi sela, which is great, but now I don't have a shiur for a gris. What am I supposed to do now? And the shiur gris isn't connected to fingers. So all our knowledge that we have about fingers now doesn't help us with the gris. We have to start from scratch. So that's why the Alter Rebbe started from scratch. So he says, and this is where I come in. The Madil says, I, the brother, tziva li achi harav, and the Alter Rebbe is going to try a 3rd tack. The Chacham Tzvi went with beans, the miltstaka went with lentils, and the Alter Rebbe says, let's give measuring the hairs a second look. He said, I should measure myself. He gave me the task. I should measure the shetach mekoim hasa'aris, the way they're spread out on the arm. Right? So it seems like the Alter Rebbe gave up on ever identifying correctly the Gris and the Adashim. And apparently he also does not accept the halacha that we should just use whatever the biggest Gris we can find is. Or at least it's not relevant to determining what the original Shiur was supposed to be. Now, how did he get to that? How did he get to measuring this? The Me'il Tzedakah already established that it's the body, not the head, right? If it was the head, we said it would be tiny. And that the Alter Rebbe liked, as we said. How did he get to measuring here? Kemeduma, that he saw it in one of the more recent Sfarim, and then in parentheses, it was added that it's the Shut Meir Nesivim. Shut Meir Nesivim is by Meir Magalius. He's described as one of the first Chassidish Rabbanim after the Baal Shem Tov. He passed away in Tafkuf Nun, 1790. He was the Rav of Astra. And in Tafkuf Nun Aleph, a year later after his passing, they printed Meir Nesivim, which has Shalos HaTshuvas. And there's a tshuva there where he and another Rav are discussing the Chacham Tzvi. Some of the points in the tshuva are cited on the daf by the Pischei Tshuva. And among other things, he emphasizes this shear of going with the hair. And he writes, Binyan Ashir halacha l'maisa, even though it's already bar etzli, that if the Meira does not have a Gris shel poil, because he actually, among other things, also holds that halacha l'maisa, you should just use the biggest bean you find. And that he goes even further than the Chacham Tzvi. But if you don't have one, then you should do the shear shisha sayres, hein va'aviron, the whole cheshbon on the arm. The perek hayad, hu azroya, shebein kaf hayad ubein haperek. That's the best place to measure. So Alter Rebbe accepted that Yesod from the Meir Nesivim, and he told me how to do it. He gets into the technicalities and how they use the mechuga, the tools, somewhat scientific tools to measure. And he got the Reuven HaSefer involved, the famous Sefer of the Alter Rebbe. And he's very good. He's very good with precise movements. And we made a square, and then we made a circle with the same area as the square. So he's describing the whole story of how he was the shlichus, the special shlichus that he had from the Alter Rebbe. We're not going to try too hard to understand it, because this is the kind of thing where I believe also we just sort of rely on the Alter Rebbe and Maril's Cheshbon, and we're not trying to reproduce this calculation ourselves. We'll trust the Alter Rebbe and Maril on this. And what was the midah that resulted? Kemidas matbeya pitachak. Still a word in Russian. Pitachak is a 5 kopek coin. Silver pitachak from the days of the Kesaris, the Tsarina. In the 1700s, there were 2 queens, 2 eras in Russia where they were ruled by a queen. It doesn't say which, that's part of the problem. B'mei Kesaris, hakoil mida achas. Oh, here we just transitioned from geometric shapes in the Me'il Tzedakah into the realm of coins. And that's the last 200 years. It's all about the coins. Everyone with their coin. What is the shear of the pitachak? That's what we're leaving for the special shear in Hashem tomorrow night. And the Alter Rebbe, he says, Kibel mimeni midazu. He accepted it, and he always carried around a pitachak, taka, from then on, to be Meshayar when he had Shalos and Ksamim. Meaning that they were still available, even though at that point the Kesaris was no longer, but that coin was still in circulation. And then there are other Mekaydas later. We have a tshuva from the Tzemach Tzedek's son, Rabbi Yisrael Nayach, who was asked about this, and he said, I just spoke to my father, and he said that lately we've been using the polished Geshel Poilin. So we see both that it seems like they went with this Lahalach Lamaisa, the Tzemach Tzedek, Yisrael Nayach, and there's another coin to also add to the exciting research, which will also be part of that share.
What's that called?
Polishke. And then he mentions that he couldn't figure out the Me'il Tzedakah's cheshbon. And then he says he asked him about the termis, which is really connected to this discussion, but we're not, the Gris versus the termis, we don't have time and energy to get into that. But in the middle, we'll just note that in the middle he mentions V'hagris lefit tziyurai, the Gris according to the Me'il Tzedakah, who kamatbeya aleph gimel shin shalakei saris. That's like the size of the gimel shin. Gimel shin is the golden shtick. What's the size of that? We'll also leave that for that discussion. So now, for most of the Welt, the Me'il Tzedakah remains the shita that they follow. And now there are just many discussions as to the resulting pratim from that shita, including what is the exact size of the shita of the Me'il Tzedakah. So in one of the Kaivitzim, Satmar, Kaivitz Bezvad Chacham, there's an article by someone in Antwerp who was masakim everything according to coins. The whole article is built around coin sizes. So he says, Reb Chaim Noah Taka wrote that the sheet of the milled stock is in fact 21 millimeters, which is equivalent to our nickel. The Chazon Ish and many others said it's slightly less, 20 point something. Darkei Tshuva, Munkacher writes that Roiv Achreinim, at least in his milieu, said that it's 19 millimeters, which is equivalent to our penny. He says the Debret Sinner and the Shevet Halevi used to somewhere between 18 and 19, maybe depending on the situation. And then Badei Shulchan has the biggest chumrah within the milled stock. He says it's 18 millimeters, which is like the dime. And we'll leave that with that. Now, when it comes to the Alter Rebbe, right? So then we have Reb Chaim Noah in his sefer, Shiur Torah Siman Gimel Eis Chaf. He writes, some say Bechlal, the Gris is 21 millimeters, that's his Havana in the milled staka. And some say it's a lot less, the 5 kopek coin, which is of course the Alter Rebbe. And he writes, 14 millimeters, v'chein iker. In the Ha'ara he writes, I could not get a hold of a pita chak, but what I remember, implying that he saw one once, or he saw something that was said to be that size. V'chein dibarti im Rabbana Mirussia, they said it's 14, 15 millimeters. And of course, you can check it out. There's a lot more in his artist there on the whole sugya. On the other hand, you have Tarak Halacha, Perek Bezes Daled, who states that according to the Alter Rebbe, it's 16.5 millimeters, and according to the milled stock, it's no more than 1920. And when it comes to the Alter Rebbe, he relied on those who researched these inyanim in the last few years, and they said they researched the coins, and they concluded that Pita Chak was 16.5, 16 and a half, not 14. Reb Chaim Noah is wrong. And that's also, we're leaving that for that shiur. That's what the big focus of the shiur by Rabbi Gris is going to be about. Emir Hashem, they also say B'Shem Reb Zalman Shimon. Reb Zalman Shimon said to use a dime, which also suggests a larger shiur, but then there are those who want to partach what he said.
What did Tarak Halacha say about the Miltzadaka shiur?
Also a little smaller than Reb Chaim Noah says, 1920. But, and let's just conclude with the maybe the most fun part. We said that essentially the Alter Rebbe changed his whole shitta and all Shiur Torah from Agudal, which is 25 millimeters, to 20 millimeters. So we find there's a big outburst by none other than the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish in Kuntus HaShiurim, similar Matas, I have it right here. He wants to make the case, of course, that the Agudal is 25, and he says, the good proof for that is the Shiur Gris Shel Ksamim, 5 by 5 Sa'orim. And you do the math, if you go with only Ches Sa'oris, then it won't work. He says, what? Can't be. Everyone else said it was bigger. The finger, no one could ever come to the conclusion that the finger itself is actually smaller. That's impossible. And we can't abandon all the chacham and follow a yachid, a pisipur maisa. And the Grashaz Ba'atzmai in his Sefer wrote like the majority according to the Chazon Ish. And he didn't write in the Sefer that he changed his mind. And he didn't announce his Chazara to the world. How could it be that he was Matrik Samim earlier that were Asr in his opinion? Must mean the Alter Rebbe never disagreed about the finger. The Alter Rebbe must have gotten some extra oversized So'eris. And that's how he came to the conclusion that the So'eris are what they are. And the Sheidas Yehuda must have walked out in the middle of a conversation. It's all one big misunderstanding. How unfortunate. But the Alter Rebbe, the Grashaz, certainly must have come to the right conclusion. He must have realized that the barley is oversized. Of course, we have to follow the mainstream according to the Chazon Ish. And Bechlal, who says a person's even neman to tell you that a God will change his mind? So in Tarak Halacha, as well as in Heichal HaBesht, that article by Rabbi Greenwald, which also builds up to this. So in page Lamed, Biyurim, let's just finish with this. In Biyurim Beis, he goes through the Chazon Ish piece by piece. And of course, the point broadly is that it's a complete misunderstanding of the Sheidas Yehuda's relationship with the Alter Rebbe. It's also a complete misunderstanding of what the Sheidas Yehuda wrote, that it was a long term, he measured many fingers of many people. There's no chance that the Alter Rebbe found the wrong So'erim one day. And the Alter Rebbe told him to go do it, and there's no conversation that he walked down in the middle of. And he says it's very clear that in fact the Chazon Ish probably never even saw the Sheidas Yehuda B'Fnim. He must have seen a quotation somewhere out of context, or at least lacking some of the context, maybe only what Reb Chaim Noah quoted, and that's why he came to such an absurd conclusion And he throws in a line, maybe we should say that Lav Mar Barav Ashi Chasim on what the Chazon Ish wrote. So, and maybe that has something to do with the dynamics between Chabad and that Welt, that Chug. And we conclude with that. And of course, it doesn't cover everything, but that gives you the general picture from the Mishnah till today.